Hello everyone, welcome to this SHRA Masterclass on procurement. My name is Bevan Jones. I'm an Associate Director at Turner & Townsend, and we are running the Social Housing Retrofit Accelerator on behalf of the BEIS and the GLA. The Social Housing Retrofit Accelerator has been developed to help those social landlords who are looking to bid in the next round of the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. It's been developed with and for the sector using expertise from within Turner & Townsend's social housing business, but also from industry experts and those delivering social housing. The SHDF is eligible for those landlords across England for major retrofit projects to decarbonise their stock. We have been giving free support since July, and this has taken the form of these masterclasses, for example, but also briefing sessions, drop-in sessions, and publications and our SHRA website, where you can find all the information. Just a reminder, local authorities will need to be the lead bidder, but can form consortium of smaller or additional organisations. One of the key things with decarbonisation projects is procurement. And so we've developed this masterclass to give you the basics of where procurement within a social housing and decarbonisation context should be. It's a key element of getting decarbonisation projects right, and ensuring that you get the best value for money, and also the best contractors and consultants within your project to ensure that you are delivering against the design. In this session, we're going to cover what is procurement, the principles of good procurement, the routes that you can take to procurement, skills needed within procurement exercises, and some high-level tips for getting that right. So very basically, we strip this back to its basic definition. Procurement is the buying of goods and services that enable an organisation to operate in a profitable and ethical manner. Within the public sector, there is a focus on value for money, i.e. getting the best mix of quality and effectiveness for the least outlay over a period of use of goods or services bought. And that is relevant because we are investing in our housing stock over the next 30 years to decarbonise it to be in line with the government's net zero trajectory. And really, the onus is on social landlords on getting that procurement right, because you have access to public money, you are working with tenants and you're working with citizens to make sure that that money is well spent and that decarbonisation projects deliver on multiple fronts, whether it's fuel poverty, whether it's decarbonisation, whether it's improving the quality of the stock. Getting that procurement and providing value for money is really important. So within our social housing context, and we're talking specifically about social housing here because procurement, you can have different principles in different sectors, but here within social housing, we've stripped this back to kind of 5 good principles. So there's 2 general ones. Ideally, procurement should be achieved through competition or a competitive process. So a landlord, for example, will go to the market and instead of just going for one solution and picking their favourite company, the idea is that several companies bid for an opportunity and the giving an account of their ability to deliver, the quality that they can deliver, and some idea of cost and timescales, so that the purchasing organisation, i.e. a social landlord, can make a decision based on that process. Procurement should always also be in line with nationally or internationally agreed legislation and obligations. And there's a bit of repetition here because obviously that is a principle of good procurement in social housing. So the regulator of social housing lists 3 good principles here. So it's about demonstrating value for money. It's about demonstrating propriety and good practice. So making sure that that procurement process is transparent and that it can be audited and then it can be judged against the decision that's made if there are any disputes or if there is any suspicion of impropriety. And lastly, as in line with the general principles, should comply with public sector procurement legal requirements. Okay. Now, there are several routes to procurement. There are several routes to procurement, and these are broadly split into 4 areas. There's open procedure, so tenders can be designed to invite suppliers to respond with a proposal by a set date, and their proposals are then evaluated by a decision-making panel within that organisation through a predefined system of scoring. That's probably a very simple explanation of what open procedure is. Restricted procedure, which is fairly common within social housing, is a 2-stage process where we often use a pre-qualification questionnaire, or PQQ, is probably a term that you've heard, to ascertain whether or not a potential bidder is ready to go on to undertake a formal process. Now, a PQQ is essentially a sifting exercise, and it will allow the purchaser to identify who does qualify for this type of role. There are pros and cons to this, and there's lots of arguments that it excludes smaller suppliers because they may not have the experience of filling in this type of exercise or delivering the projects. But there are also some advantages to it in that it provides a social housing provider with a short list of appropriate contractors. A PQQ, once assessed and once a short list is drawn up, will be followed by an invitation to tender. So again, this is where we get into a similar field of the open procedure, whereby then there is a call for a proposal. That proposal is then evaluated and scored by a predefined system. That this restricted procedure is fairly common. On the right-hand side here, we've got 2 procedures which are not as common, but are still part of the routes. So you've got your competitive dialogue procedure and your negotiator procedure. With competitive dialogue, following on from the contract notice and the selection, the purchaser will negotiate with the contractors to develop a specific and suitable solution, whereby the contractor is developing a proposal which is exactly fitting to what the purchaser is seeing through their brief or what they're seeing through on the ground with their proposed project. This is then followed by an invitation to tender. Negotiated procedure is what it says on the tin. Contract negotiations are entered into with 1 or more suppliers. Now, there are pros and cons to all of these, and we're not going to address them all here, but something like a negotiated procedure can allow you to build relationships with the supply chain, but it also can be time consuming. And in a world where we are facing limited resources, particularly within local authorities, and where we might not have the skills in-house to do that, negotiated procedure may not be one of the more popular options. So really, this is not the tender process. This is an example tender process. We have just put here to kind of demonstrate that you could be looking at something like a 10-stage process. And this does relate back to some of the other masterclasses and some of the other briefings we have given, and is particularly relevant to SHDF. It's all about understanding the skills that you have within your organisation. And on previous masterclasses, we've talked about undertaking a skills matrix within your consortia or within your teams to understand where your skills gaps are. Within this, you will need a person or people who have procurement expertise. So forming that procurement team, where you do need a procurement person, but you may need someone who has sustainability expertise. You may need an asset manager. You may need a senior person to provide that kind of governance ironcladding to the process. But forming that procurement team is vital, and having good communications between that team is also vital for understanding how you're going to score and what you really want out of this process. The second stage, I'm not going to run through all of these, but the second stage is really important. These early stages, the four in blue on the left-hand side, are really, really important for getting the tender exercise right. By developing tender and evaluation criteria, you're then letting the market know how you intend to score this, but you're also putting the parameters around how you are going to make a decision that gives value for money and meets those good principles of procurement. Now, there are several ways to market, whether that is through a framework, whether that is through open procedures, but it's worth drawing up your PQQ long list, your ideal supplier, and then releasing that tender in a timely fashion and setting realistic timescales for when you want contractors to respond, but also, and perhaps more importantly, given restricted resources within local authority, how long you are going to take to assess that, because we don't want procurement exercises drawn out over a long period of time, because we start to hit some of the poor principles of procurement. So I won't run through the rest, but you can see that there is a submission evaluation finalisation exercise. You may want to issue the ITT from that stage on. You select your contractors, you enter into negotiations, and then eventually you will award a contract. So for those people who aren't familiar with the procurement process, this is just a sample one, which is two-stage, which is PQQ and ITT, and that's just to give you an idea of what a procurement process might look like. Now, again, speaking to the limited resources, but also the fact that we have a market for procurement in the UK, we have a proper market for public sector procurement. There are other options to look at as well. There are a number of procurement frameworks within the UK, and what a procurement framework is an agreement that's been put in place with a range of providers that allows a buyer to purchase goods and services from an approved list of suppliers without having to run a full tendering exercise. Suppliers generally are brought onto frameworks at a fixed point in time, and they usually have to bid to be on a framework and meet certain criteria, whether that is in terms of quality, certification, proving their track record of projects to actually be brought onto that framework. So quite a rigorous process to bring a supply chain into one place. Now, dynamic purchasing system is similar to a traditional framework, but it allows suppliers to join at any time. We have in dynamic purchasing systems mini tender exercises, which we call call-offs, which allow buyers to buy services as and when they need it. There are cost savings potentially because this is dynamic, and because suppliers can enter if a new entrant comes in, or if someone who previously hasn't been on there, they provide competition to the other suppliers, and potentially this drives efficiency and cost savings for clients. But also for a buyer, it allows increased access in order to reach suppliers in the market, which perhaps they would not have done previously. Also, because of the dynamism of these systems, and their openness, it's sometimes easier for smaller housing associations or local authorities to access the skills that they need without having to perform the financial outlay that may otherwise stop them from completing decarbonisation projects. I think there are really 5 key skills for good procurement. That's contract management. You've got to have KPIs. You've got to have an idea of what you're going to be doing performance-wise. You've got to have a way of enforcing it, and you've got to have a way of having that dialogue with the contractor if they are underperforming, but equally how you can reward contractors for good performance. There needs to be an element of strategic management skills in there. It must link back to the corporate commitments, strategy, and business case for particular projects. And it's a good skill to have to be able to see how the project sits within the bigger organisational picture. Risk management is a key skill. The procurement team really does need to draw up their top risks for a project, how that potentially impacts, scoring those risks, but also having early development of the mitigations of those risks, and in a project time managing those risks effectively and reviewing them on a regular basis. Relationship management is also key, whether that is with a contractor or whether that is internally within an organisation. But building relationships with the people delivering this project will enable you to keep the project moving at pace, but also have those difficult conversations if or when they're needed in a way that is non-confrontational, but which allows for the consistent delivery and the continued delivery of a project, and that's really important. But perhaps most importantly here is all organisations should see procurement exercises as a project. So it should have a process, it should have milestones, it should have timescales, it should have targets, it should have an idea of how you want to perform as the purchaser during the procurement exercise. Are you willing to let timescales slip? Are you willing to enter into negotiations with potential contractors or suppliers earlier than you would have done? So knowing those milestones, knowing your expectations of the procurement process and treating it as a project is really important. Post-Brexit. Now, this has come up in a number of our briefings and workshops, and so we've addressed it here. Post-Brexit, the UK government is looking to bring in a procurement bill, which is going to include some new provisions. Now, I won't run through all of this, but what we see here, perhaps one of the most important ones, is enshrinement of value for money, public benefit, transparency, integrity, fair treatment of suppliers, and non-discrimination within law. And that's a big step, because at the minute value for money is the priority, and things like public benefit, integrity, fair treatment, non-discrimination are all seen as potential additions to good procurement, but these are now probably going to be enshrined. There will need to be regard for the government's strategic priorities. I think this is a really important one, particularly net zero. So suppliers are really going to have to be, and purchasers are really going to have to take note of what they need to do in this space to make it compliant with the government's key priorities, such as net zero. There will be more of a focus on exclusion. How that works in reality, that's not known. But there was a big focus on poor performance of contracts and those projects, and this is particularly key for decarbonisation projects, where we've known for a long time that there is often a design versus performance gap, which may not be filled by the supplier's solution, and which leads to poor performance and ultimately a cost for the purchaser. And those are just some of the post-Brexit provisions that are being discussed at present. So if we want to extend the principles of good procurement to the principles of sustainable procurement, we've provided this quick list here, the elimination list is obviously a lot shorter and obviously common sense. We want to avoid forced or compulsory labour. You want to avoid child labour. You want to avoid any bribery and corruption and impropriety within a procurement exercise. But actually, the great things about sustainable procurement are what we can promote. So having a positive environmental impact. How is the project going to enhance the environment rather than just impact on it? Is the project providing social value? Is it providing value to the community? How are we dealing with equality and diversity within the project, and is enhancing those elements? And there are a few other things on that list as well. So just to bear in mind, that's a really quick list of what you should be thinking about if you're trying to procure sustainably. I'll also add, and probably there's going to be a bigger focus on this in decarbonisation projects, circularity, eliminating waste and promoting reuse, remanufacture, recycling of products within the industry, and that's a really important point as well. And then really, these are the top tips, and these are the ways you can start getting it right in terms of procuring for decarbonisation projects. Start early. You really do need to understand the scope of what you're going to do. You really need to understand what you need to procure and what you're going to have to do in terms of getting that project delivered. And really ask that question, you know, what is the correct approach in procurement for your decarbonisation project? Take advice. Procurement can look opaque and it can be difficult for people who are non-specialists. Every organisation has procurement professionals, and it's really important to understand from them what's the right process for me, how should this exercise be run, what are the parameters I should put around it. I touched on this earlier, but be clear on timings, be clear with your people submitting bids that what evidence they need to require, what evidence they need to submit, what performance requirements are going to be looked at, and how you're going to score against a predetermined framework. When the project is in that development phase, when you've got your procurement team in place, really need to start looking at the performance framework, and that does speak to start early, but you should understand how you want the building to perform, what that means in terms of specification, and then how that feeds down into what you expect from suppliers. Plan for soft landings. We really hear the term soft landings a lot. I'm not sure that it happens on every project, and I'm not sure people really understand what it means, but right at the beginning of the project, and constantly throughout the project when you're reviewing progress, you should always have an eye on the post-contract transition away from the supplier to your management and maintenance regime. That should start early as possible, and there should always be an item, as it were, on soft landings and post-contract transition. Good communication, whether that's internally or externally, whether you purchase through a framework or dynamic purchasing or through your own exercise, the communication is vital to make sure that suppliers and those bidding, as well as internal teams, are clear on what this procurement exercise will do. And then be realistic. Can you run this exercise as an organisation? Do you have the resources? Do you have the skills to score appropriately and get what you want? Are you going to achieve your value for money? Are you going to have enough time to assess the bids? All these questions are really important, and it's really important to be realistic when you're undertaking procurement for decarbonisation projects. Thanks for taking the time to listen. As I say, the Social Housing Retrofit Accelerator is ongoing, and there is a multitude of support which you can find on our website, which is socialhousingretrofit.org.uk. And also, if you would like to get in touch and find out a bit more or speak to us about procurement or any other areas within the decarbonisation project process, you can email us on info@socialhousingretrofit.org.uk. Thanks very much.